Welcome, boys and girls, to Chapter 2 in The Broken Blade. So, first chapter, Pierre was a little bit lazy, supposed to be chopping wood, didn't do it. Dad does it instead. Dad gets injured. So we'll see what Pierre does to help out his family. See if he's a good guy or if he's not such a good guy. So on Monday morning, Pierre visited with his father before he left for school. Pierre sat carefully down beside him. You know, Pierre said, this wouldn't have happened if I'd been... Father interrupted him. It's not your fault. I chopped off my thumb, he said, scowling at the heavy bandage in disgust. Short, dark, and always energetic, Father was never one to hide his feelings. His voice resounded with conviction. The same voice that loved to sing and tell stories. Pierre stared at the wrapped thumb, imagining the stub and the stitched flap of skin. What he wanted to say was, tell the truth, Father. Tell how my laziness has crippled you. You'll not hear this Evernon complain about anything but his own clumsiness, Pierre's father continued. Why, I was wielding an axe when I was half your size. But if I'll hear none of it. And I'll thank you not to manufacture excuses for me. I'm old enough to know the difference between a stick of wood and my thumb. As Pierre left the bedroom, he heard the nervous whispers of his mother and sister. He knew what they were talking about. His father was scheduled to sign his engagement papers with the Northwest Company this very week. Like most of the men in Lachine, Canada, Pierre's father was a voyageur who freighted goods from Montreal to Grand Portage, or Portage, however you want to call it, which is now in Minnesota. Montreal's in Canada, but Grand Portage is now in a state called Minnesota. At the time of the height of the fur trade, Minnesota was not a state yet. So he knew the Ottawa River system and the Great Lakes as well as any man alive, and the canoes he guided were famous for their speed. If Father couldn't sign on, Camille, who was already 17, would work as a maid or a housekeeper to help the family survive. They might manage if Mother could do the same, but she needed to take care of Pierre's baby sister, Claire. When Pierre was sat down to breakfast, Camille asked, Are you all right? He ignored her, hating the way she babied him lately. Since she got an engagement ring last Christmas from a Montreal boy, it was as if he had two mothers. Hang on a second, I gotta flip the page here, peeps. Two mothers. She always was ordering him around. And to make matters even worse, she had a loud voice like Father's. Even a casual comment sounded irritatingly bossy. Pierre couldn't wait until she was married next summer and moved into a house of her own. As he ate, Pierre watched little Claire tug at Camille's hair ribbon. Though Claire had spent the first 6 months of her life crying, she was smiling a lot lately. Last week, she even pointed at Pierre and said, Bah! A word he proudly insisted meant brother. If this baby had to go hungry because of him, Pierre would never forgive himself. What could he do? So after breakfast, Pierre left for school. Pierre's mother insisted he go to school, even though most of his friends had left the schoolroom and gone to work. Like Father, Mother wasn't shy about her opinions. She'd always told her son that he would be a great man someday. She hoped he would become a judge, a merchant, or even a priest. But Pierre didn't care to look that far ahead. School had always been easy for Pierre. But now that he was 13 and the oldest boy still enrolled, he was bored. Sister Marguerite tried to make things even more interesting by having him tutor the younger students, but tutoring was dull compared with the stories his working friends told of their lives as canoemen, lumberjacks, and apprentice tradesmen. He was tired of being a mere schoolboy when everyone else was entering the real world. They were driving wagons and piloting riverboats and voyaging in canoes, while he was stuck memorizing Latin verbs. This morning, though, he told no one of his plan. He walked straight past his school to the waterfront district and the main depot of the Northwest Company. The riverbank was crowded with at least 12 dozen men. The voyageurs were dressed in red caps, short shirts tied with bright sashes, breechclouts, deerskin leggings, and moccasins. They were all busy packing trade goods and working on their canoes. Pierre felt nervous and out of place. He never stayed away from school before, and he worried about what his mother would think. During breakfast, when he planned this trip in his mind, he thought it'd be easy to find a company clerk or one of his father's friends, but he had no idea where to begin in this maze of men. So he walked over to a fellow who was holding a torch in his hand and dripping a ball of pitch onto the seams of a canoe. Pierre tapped the man on the shoulder. Excuse me, sir, could... The man stood up and growled. What you want with Bellegarde? Pierre quickly drew back. This was the ugliest man he'd ever seen. The man's hair was thin and scraggly. One of his earlobes was missing. And the left side of his face was pushed in towards the center. White scars ran along his cheek and nose in stark relief against his dark face. Hang on a second here, boys and girls. I got a flipperooski. Here we go. I was looking. Could you tell me? The fumes from the torch burned Pierre's eyes. He coughed. The voyager threw back his head and laughed. One front tooth was missing. You used to prettier men than André Bellegarde, he said. But I tell you, I'm the best looking fellow you'll ever see who wrestled a grizzly bear and lost. One swipe to the head. He pointed to the jagged scars with the warm pitch blocking his hand. It's all it take. It's all it took to make this mess. Pierre could think of nothing to say. I'm sorry. To save your pity for the dead, boy. Bellegarde spat into the sand at Pierre's feet. Besides, that bear's worse off than me. He rattled the bear claw necklace that hung down in front of his leather shirt. Don't never be sorry for no man what's still alive. Pierre stared at the bear claws as huge as a man's fingers. His eyes widened. Please, I'm looking for your brigade chief. Mackay? The man said, pointing with his torch towards a log storehouse just up the riverbank. For a moment, Pierre thought about heading back to the schoolhouse. He liked to go slowly to consider every option, but he could tell that these men plunged headlong into their work. As he walked cautiously up the bank, men hurried by on all sides, carrying bundles of trade goods, laughing and whistling. One man with a powder keg on each shoulder and called out, "Step aside, boy! These casks got more bite than you care to handle." This is the company his father kept. Dark-skinned, with heavy-muscled arms and shoulders, each man carried 2 90-pound bales of cargo on his back. That's 180 pounds total, people. That is a lot of weight. A few staggering fellows hauled 3 parcels without complaint. That's 270 pounds, people. Yikes. As Pierre studied the men, he recalled the first time his father brought him down to this landing. He was only 7 or 8. One of the last brigades of the season was just arriving, and Father hoisted him on his shoulders so he could see over the gathering crowd. Pierre counted 24 canoes. 24 canoes, people. Each one of these bad boys is 36 to 40 feet long. Yikes, those are big canoes, and they're made out of birch bark. It's the biggest brigade of the year, Father said. Then he whispered, that's more than $1 million worth of pelts in those canoes. Not bad for a single season fur trade with Indians, eh? I remember, boys and girls, looking at your vocabulary. I hope you remember what a pelt is. Pelt is an animal's skin with fur on it. That's what they were after. Beaver pelts. $1 million, Pierre repeated. Yes, Father nodded. And a lot of it paddled and portaged more than 1,000 miles from Grand Portage, just so gentlemen can wear beaver pelt hats. Hats? Pierre looked at his father's simple red cap. Beaver hats this tall, Father said, raising his hand to an absurd height above his head, for fancy gents to wear when they walk with fancy ladies. When Pierre reached the top of the riverbank, there was no mistaking Commander McKay. He stood half a head taller than any of the men clustered around him. Bushy red hair covered his face and ringed his balding head, and he dressed more like a banker than a frontiersman. An unlit briar pipe stuck out of his vest pocket. A pencil stub was tucked behind one ear. He was deep in conversation with another man. When McKay finally noticed Pierre, he stopped. What did it be, laddie? Well, I've come to engage, sir, Pierre said. Bit young, aren't ye? Pierre lied. Oh, I'm nearly 14. He had just turned 13 a month before. But at 5 feet 5 inches and 130 pounds, he was confident he can do the work of a man, though he knew his boyish face and cropped hair made him look young. Sorry, but we don't have time to play nursemaid. Our trips are a hard push all the way. McKay looked again at his list. Pierre's face reddened as he struggled to think of a reply. He knew McKay wouldn't care that he could spell well or that he'd won Sister's Geography Prize 3 years in a row. He hated himself for his shyness. Why couldn't he be loud and bold like his father? Finally, he said, I can paddle hard. I really can. My father, Charles LePage, he's worked for the Northwest Company since he was 12. Yeah, that's all well and good, McKay replied without looking up. But it's a steersman we need, lad. We've middlemen enough to paddle us clear to China. Pierre thought of little Claire and the hard winter his family would face without father's wages. He had to think of something, but before he could speak again, a voice spoke up. Pardon me, Mr. McKay. A thin, light-skinned man with gray eyes strolled up to Pierre. Did you say that you're Charles LePage's son? Yeah, I am. Stepping closer to Pierre, the man stopped and stared. Suddenly he made a fist and touched it to the tip of Pierre's chin. His rock-hard knuckles tilted Pierre's head back. The fellow grinned and clapped Pierre on the shoulders, nearly knocking him over. That blonde hair could have fooled me, but you got Charles's firm jaw, square-like, with that little hollow. Can you take a punch like your pa? The man held up his fist again and grinned. McKay looked up. You and this LePage fellow mates, Charbonneau? We wintered together up in Athabasca. If he's Charlie's son, I'll vouch for him. You sure? I could use one more middleman in my canoe. Well, that's fine with me, but you see it true. Yes, sir. Charbonneau touched his cap. I will, sir. Though Pierre was grateful to Charbonneau for his helping, the man's pushy military manner made Pierre nervous. Pierre's father made fun of soldiers. He called them silly saluters who loved to play dress-up. And Charbonneau seemed to be that type. Without another word, McKay drew out an official-looking piece of parchment. It's a kind of paper they used back then, parchment. He lifted for the glass stopper from the inkwell, and he dipped in his goose quill pen. Writing in bold script, McKay filled in Pierre's engagement papers with the date, May 11th, 1800, and his full name. McKay then handed the pen to Pierre when Pierre signed his name to the contract and didn't just make an X, like most of the men. McKay asked, What do you think of that, Charbonneau? Any lad who writes such a strong hand should be a fine peddler. Charbonneau made no comment. He frowned at the fancy writing on the contract. You see, boys and girls, most of the men back then didn't know how to write. So when it came time to signing their names, all they could do was make an X instead of their signature. Couldn't write and they couldn't read. Next, while McKay checked each item off the list, Charbonneau issued Pierre the standard Northwest Company supplies. A blanket, a shirt, a pair of trousers. Trousers are pants, people. 2 handkerchiefs and a 2-pound twist of carrot tobacco. When Charbonneau counted out 1/3 advance on a year's salary, Pierre felt proud, knowing he had done the right thing. So here he's getting 33% of his salary for the whole year just for signing on. Holy cow. McKay then concluded Pierre's engagement by shaking his hand and saying, Just make sure you stay clear of those Hudson Bay rascals. See, Northwest Company was in direct competition with another company called Hudson's Bay. So they were competitors during the fur trade, Hudson Bay and Northwest Company. And we're hearing about in this story of the men who worked for the Northwest Company. Knowing how much the Northwest men hated their arch rival, the Hudson's Bay Company, Pierre quickly said, I will, sir. McKay then turned to Charbonneau. Have him work with La Petite today. That should keep him busy. Charbonneau nodded with a wry smile, and he marched around the table toward a log storehouse. Charbonneau was long-legged and lean compared to the other voyageurs. His quick movements reminded Pierre of Monsieur Marot, a man who owned a combined livery stable and funeral parlor in Lachine. Charbonneau had the same sort of thin face, all sharp points and angles. Pierre had to walk fast to keep up. He wondered what sort of fellow this little La Petite might be. Just before they passed through the low doorway of the storehouse, McKay called after them, Make sure La Petite has secured that last Montreal canoe. Charbonneau turned and acknowledged McKay's command. Aye, sir. Tell him to make sure she's cocked tight. The last we hired from that scoundrel Laglois leaked like a rotten thatch job. With one last eye, Charbonneau led Pierre into the storeroom. The only light inside was cast by an oil lamp. Pierre had never seen such vast piles of goods, bolts of calico cloth and ribbon, and crates crammed with bells and colored beads, and mirrors and sewing materials. They were piled on shelves and lined either wall. Stacked around the room were other boxes that held spears, ice chisels, and gaff hooks. For trapping beaver during the winter. Kegs and nested copper kettles were stacked near the entry. The thought of hauling all these trade goods the length of the Great Lakes suddenly made Pierre uneasy. Anyone can sign his name and pocket his salary, he thought. But what about portaging cooking pots and musket balls and 35-foot lake canoes? La Petite, Charbonneau called, squinting into the half-dark. Where is that fellow gone now? He mumbled. La Petite! Charbonneau tried again, stepping forward and calling twice as loudly. Out of the corner of his eye, Pierre thought he saw a dim shadow. before he could turn, two hands seized his ankles from behind and suddenly jerked his feet out from underneath him. Yeah! Pierre threw out his hands to keep his face from smashing into the dirt floor. An instant later, he was swinging upside down, staring at the largest pair of moccasins he'd ever seen. Let me go! Pierre yelled. Someone laughed uproariously. So what have you brought me, Charbonneau? Something to shelve or to stick in a nice little keg? Charbonneau laughed as Lapetit swung Pierre up toward the rafters and let go of his ankles. Pierre squealed again, thinking for a moment that this giant intended to kill him. But Lapetit caught the boy by his armpits just as he began to fall and set him back down. That's a good one, Lapetit, Charbonneau chortled, hiding in the dark. You do know how to spook a fellow. Meet your helper for the day, Pierre Lepage. This fellow they called Lapetit was the biggest and the blackest Frenchman Pierre had ever seen. His frizzy black hair brushed the log-tied beams overhead. His pants and shirt were deerskin and smelled as they'd been tanned with pig brains and smoke. When Lapetit reached out his hand, Pierre took a step back and trampled Charbonneau's foot. Stand still, boy, Charbonneau ordered, pushing him forward again. Pierre braced himself, afraid to imagine what this giant would do to him next. Please pardon my behavior, monsieur, Lapetit said, bowing at the waist and pretending to remove a cap from his bare head. Had I known you were my assistant, I would not have treated you so rudely. He then let out a deep chuckle, and he toused Pierre's hair. To work now, he added, and he started toward the rear of the building, expecting Pierre to follow. And Pierre did follow, all morning and all afternoon without stopping. Accustomed to the calm of school, Pierre was amazed at the frantic pace Lapetit maintained. They sorted trade goods. They hauled supplies to another warehouse on a big flatbed wagon. They inspected the new Montreal canoes at boatworks. They learned a lot about fur trade merchandise, and he was glad to discover that the giant Lapetit was a gentle and fair fellow. Lapetit explained each job to Pierre. And was patient with Pierre's questions. Unlike the intense Charbonneau, he walked with a relaxed stride, whistling or humming as he worked. The big man even took Pierre's side late that afternoon when an evil-looking character confronted Pierre just after they returned from the boatworks. Who's your little lady friend, Lapetit? The man said, sneering at Pierre with the black, unblinking eyes of a snake. Leave my grandpa alone, Bellois, Pierre Lapetit said, wagging a finger at his face. He's a good worker. Unafraid of Lapetit's warning, Bellois spat in the dust at Pierre's feet and said, Send him to the dressmaker. Pierre couldn't help but staring at Bellois. He wore a soiled shirt, open at the neck, and his chest was covered with matted black hair. His ragged beard and stooped shoulders made him look more like a bear than a man, but the thing that startled Pierre most was his nose. The right half had been ripped off. Bellois scowled one last time and walked away, grumbling to himself. As soon as he was out of earshot, Pierre asked Lapetit, what happened to him? That's quite a nose, isn't it? Lapetit chuckled. Why, he's a fighter, Grandpa. He just loves to scrap. One day a fellow with very big teeth bit the starboard side of his nose clean off. starboard side is your right side of your nose. La Petite grinned at the shock on Pierre's face. Oh, I'm meeting all the pretty ones today, aren't I? Pierre said good-naturedly. That you are. La Petite clapped him on the back and turned on board his wagon. So now Pierre had a nickname. These voyageurs, who loved to call the tallest man in their brigade by a French word for shorty, would name a smooth-faced boy such as him Grandpa. All right, so we met definitely a cast of characters here. Doesn't sound like this is going to be a very boring time for Pierre. I think he's in for more than he's gambled for. See you in the next chapter.